Okay, we're going to take a look at a few ways to create a 3D look on text by using filters. After this, we'll go into, quote, true 3D, and this is kind of a faux 3D, but there's no 3D that's real 3D, so I think these are some really useful ways to create a 3D kind of look on your text. So what I have here is I have some text with a very thick, fat font. In fact, if we bring up the heads-up display, we'll see this is an impact font, which often works best for the type of things that we're going to be doing here. And I've also, as you can see, added a very thick outline. In fact, when you add an outline like this, let's go to the text inspector to the style pane. And you can see I've got a thick outline under the face. It starts to make the text blend together, and this is a place where you might want to kern your text. I'm not going to because of the result that will end up with the filters here, but just as a reminder, if you need to kern the text, just double click on the text, click between two letters, hold down Command and Option, and then use the left or right bracket keys to move individual letters away or closer to each other. Okay, so the filters we're going to look at here, let's start with, close the heads-up display. In the library, in the filters category, we're going to start with this stylize category of filters, and there's one particular one in here called indent that I want to use. Here it is, indent. Probably more useful to look at this in list view. So I'll take this filter and I'll apply it to our text. And you can see right away it creates a nice kind of bevel look to the text where it kind of separates the inside from the outline. You don't need to have an outline to this text. In fact, if we go back to the text inspector and turn off the outline, the indent is still being applied to the text here, just the face, but it's more obvious when the outline is enabled. So it has several controls in the inspector here, in the filters inspector. The softness I like to crank up, and you can see more of a bevel when we do that. And then I really just kind of play with the other ones, including the brightness, the ambient light, the height brightness, the height sharpness, just to get a look that I like. I kind of just really mess around with these, and the light rotation. And then the depth is the main one that can really kind of bring it out. So just by kind of dragging those around, we can get a very different look to this indent filter and create a nice kind of 3D effect on the text. Now, there's something else here called height map, and that is why I have this clouds generator thrown in the project. So by default, it doesn't use any height map. Everything is kind of beveled the same way. But if I take this clouds generator, I turn it off just so we don't see it, and I drag it into the height map well, it applies this pattern of the clouds to the text and sort of make it look like it's bent up metal, like it's hammered metal, something like that. So once this is in here, we can play with the settings again, the softness a little bit, the brightness, and just try to find a look that makes it look kind of interesting. There's no set rule here. I'm just dragging along. That gets a little bit crazy, but that almost looks like foil now. And let's play with the depth. Depth is another parameter, by the way, that only goes to a certain limit by dragging the slider. It goes up to 20 in this case, but if you drag on the value field, you can go up quite a bit further. See, I'm going up to like 50, 60, and creating, I'm going to purposely go too far. With anything in motion, try to go too far and then back off. It's always a good idea. And that creates kind of an interesting modeled look there. And if we play the project, the clouds are animated by default. And even that's interesting because it now has an animated kind of 3D look to it. If you don't want it to be animated, it's easy to change. We can just select the clouds filter, go to the generators inspector, and there's a speed parameter. If I drag that to 0 and play, you'll see that it's more of a static look. Let me crank the speed back up. And we can also play with a few other things here, like the horizontal and vertical scales. We can create a very different look. If I increase the horizontal scale, maybe just have a horizontal scale, so we have kind of a stretched look. And then we can also play with the gradient as well and see if we get a little bit different left by bringing these values closer together. And then I'll go back to the filter and play with the softness values, brightness values, and create another kind of look. So just some things to consider with the indent filter. I usually don't use the height map, but it can create an interesting look when adding the clouds filter or an image, just about anything you want to add to it. I'll just reset the clouds filter. I kind of like the way that looks by default. Okay, I'm going to go back to the indent filter and take that out. So now that I've taken that out, let's play with this a little bit. I think it's a little too deep. Let's drop the depth down, and there's a little too bright. There we go, something more like that. Now there's another filter. I'm going to turn this one off. I'm going to return to the library, to the filters category, and I'm going to go still to the stylize section. There's another one called extrude that is also interesting and does a 3D type of effect. I'll drop it onto our text, and pretty straightforward. It does a straight off extrusion, and there's a control directly in the canvas here that controls the depth and the angle of the extrusion. This is another one that works well with text with an outline. If we go back to the text inspector, I can turn the outline off, and you'll see the extrusion works on the bare text just fine, but it looks again more interesting here with the outline applied. So a quick look at its parameters. Most of these are pretty self-explanatory. The distance is how deep that extrusion goes, the angle. These are things we were controlling directly in the canvas. Clipping I'll come back to in a minute. Face brightness, back brightness, pretty straightforward. Can make the look a little bit more contrast there by adjusting these. And then the gradient, if you choose a gradient, you can choose what these colors look like on the extruded part based on this gradient here. I frequently leave this just a shading. So one thing about this clipping and back size, if we make the distance quite a bit more, we can play with the clipping. Oops, I don't want to do that too much. And the back size interactively. So if I drag the back size way down, it makes the end of the extrusion much smaller, which gives the illusion that the 3D text is kind of moving back in space. And then the clipping allows you to really do a little animation. So you can set a keyframe at -100, move forward in time, and then set another keyframe, say at 0. And then we've got a little animation of a faux kind of 3D effect. So that's one kind of option. I'm going to reset that. Another thing you can do is combine both of these effects together. So I'm going to turn the indent back on, and then we get both an extrusion with a indent on top of it. I'm going to go back to the indent and see if we can't make it a little bit brighter. And that makes kind of a nice look there. Now, let's look at why I say this is a faux 3D effect. I'm going to go ahead and apply a sequence text behavior. Text animation, sequence text. And then I'm going to take this guy and move it up, and I'm also going to rotate it. I need to move it down so I can see that first control, that rotation band. Rotate it around, and then move it kind of up off the screen. Let's move it to the left too. I'm going to hold Command Spacebar to drag left to make a little more space, and then I'm going to move this, say, up and off the screen like that. Shift Z to fit back, and select the sequence text behavior. Let's trim it to about here. Doesn't really matter. Command Option O for play range out point. Now when we play it, the text all kind of flies onto the screen, but you'll notice as each of these turn, they don't keep their depth. The depth changes because it's not a true 3D effect. So it kind of spoils the effect a little bit. However, if you do this quickly, and let's increase the spread on this a little bit, you can end up with a decent 3D looking effect without really doing any real 3D in your project. A little too much spread there. Let's back that off. Okay, so one more filter we can use here. Let's go back to the library. And this time I'm going to go to the distortion category. I'll turn off these other two filters, and I'm going to use one called Sphere. Drag that on the text, and Sphere creates a sphere-like effect. And it's kind of neat because a couple things you can do. You can animate this center point. So let me undo moving it and press F3 to go to the third tab of the inspector, the filters inspector. And what we can do is, let's drag an X to move it off the screen, set a keyframe. I won't set a keyframe for that. Let's move the playhead to the beginning, set a keyframe, move forward in time, I'll set this back to 0. And now if we play this, we get a little animation with the text rolling onto the screen. It's almost like it's on a big ball. So that's one option. I'm going to reset that. We can also adjust the radius so you can just see the whole text where it's kind of blown up there. And you don't have to animate it at all. And you can have it kind of point down or point up, or animate it if you like. So this also gives kind of a faux 3D effect, as if the text is wrapped around something. And you can combine it. So we could turn on the indent filter and have an indented look to this kind of wrapped text. And then we could even turn on the extrusion and have some extrusion on it as well. In this case, I might select the extrusion and try to move it down a little bit so it doesn't pop above. Looks something like that. And now we've got 3 different filters combined together to create a 3D type of look on text. So those are a few ideas about how to use filters to create a 3D effect on text.